Have you ever had a translation disaster? Maybe you were overseas or even traveling regionally in the United States and you said something or somebody said something to you and you're like, I don't think we're talking the same language. I don't think I'm communicating with you properly. Maybe you were texting with a young person and you're reading their letters and their words and you're thinking, I don't know what that means. Or this means something different today than it did when I was a younger person. Translation disasters. They happen. They can be embarrassing. They can cause us to get something we didn't intend to get or not get something we did intend to get. Today we're going to talk about where language comes from. Why does it exist? We're going to see that God put language into human culture to protect humans from themselves and also to cause them to do what God wants us to do. Last week we picked up in Genesis and we looked at Noah and the covenant God made with him and with all humanity to not flood the earth again, to protect earth because God cares for humans and God cares for the creation that he has made. And then some things happen after that, and Moses gives us some genealogies. And I want you to look at one verse. Genesis chapter 10, verse 31 sums up these genealogies. These are Shem's sons by the clans according to their languages, in their lands and their nations. These are the clans of Noah's sons according to their family records, in their nations, the nations on earth spread out from these after the flood. So if you remember, God told Noah and his sons to fill the earth, to spread out and fill the land. And then we get these genealogies, and this is a summation of Shem's genealogy. And we get the same formula for Noah's other sons, and we see that it seems that they have spread out. They have nations, they have languages, and they've done what God commanded them to do. However, when we're going to see in our passage today, there was a hiccup in that spreading out. There was a little time where they stalled out in the process. And this chapter that we're going to look at today explains what happened to cause them to spread out. So in the chapter 10, we get kind of a summation, and we kind of get where they finally land, the languages and nations. But in the passage today, we're going to see how that happened and why it happened. So let's dive in. Let's look at Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 4. The whole earth had the same language and vocabulary. As the people migrated from the east, they found a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make oven-fired bricks." They used brick for stone and asphalt for mortar. And they said, "Come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky. Let's make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be scattered throughout the earth." So we have to start our lesson with a spoiler. Spoiler alert, they don't succeed in their plans. They don't succeed in building this tower to the heavens. They had unity. They had this language where they could all talk and communicate and figure things out, but they don't succeed. So we have to ask ourselves the question, why did God stop them? If you go back and you look at the previous passages, previous chapters, you see that in chapter 9, we learn that Noah died 350 years after the flood. They began to migrate south of where the ark landed in the region of the Mount Ararat, and they wind up in this land called Shinar. Now, this would probably have been in the region where the Tigris and Euphrates River come together. It's a fertile region. They probably wind up landing south of where Baghdad is today. And they decide to settle down. They decide to stay together because while all this time had passed, 350 years, if not more, has passed, and the people had not spread out. They had multiplied, but they had stayed together and their languages stayed the same. And the land they settled in probably didn't have a lot of rocks to quarry. They didn't go out and they didn't dig a big mine and start pulling up rocks and building their city. They had to learn some technology. So they developed this system of firing bricks. And what did they set out to build? A city and a tower. Now, we don't have any archaeological evidence of this tower. We can't go dig this tower up. But if we look at other archaeological evidence from the ancient Near East, we discover they were probably building what we call a ziggurat. Now, this is kind of like a pyramid, but a pyramid has sloping sides. But a ziggurat would be more like a wedding cake, where there's like a lower level, and then a level on top of that is tiered, and they might have a staircase or a ramp that helps you get to the top. Now, why would they do this? Now, again, later archaeological evidence shows us that people believed that the gods were in the sky. And if to worship those gods, you want to get high up on a high place. We see this later in Canaan. They worship on high places. And in this area, there weren't a whole lot of high places. You're not going to climb up on a rolling hill in the pasture or whatever. And it's not going to happen. So they build their high places. They build these ziggurats, and they can worship on top. So their worship gets to the gods above. Now, we don't know if these people believed that at the time, but that's what we learn from later generations and later cultures, so it's possible. But regardless, they're building this tower. And what does it say? And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky. Let's make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered throughout the earth." Now, again, we don't know the religious reason for building this tower, if there was one, but we see that they had two ideas in mind: renown and settlement. Let's start with this idea of seeking renown. How do people make a name for themselves today? And why do people desire renown and prestige? People today aren't that much different from the people in Genesis chapter 11. We want to be known for something. We want to do great things so people know us. We want to climb the highest mountain. We want to visit all the national parks and say, "Look what I did." We want to do these great things so that we can be known. And there's nothing wrong with doing great things. But what is the issue is the desire to be known as great. The desire to make a name for ourselves. It has to do with our self-esteem. And it comes forth from this innate attitude of pride and being special and making a name for yourself. You see, these people, they wanted to be known for something. We're going to be known for this. Generations in the future are going to say, "Look at that great tower they built. Look at the great things they did because they were special." But it wasn't just about renown. It wasn't just about pride and self-esteem. These people were seeking security. They wanted to be together. This tower is going to be an anchor for their culture, an anchor for their society. It's going to hold them together. In Genesis chapter 9, verse 7, we see God tells them, "But you, be fruitful and multiply, spread out over the earth and multiply on it." God had instructed Noah and his sons to spread out, multiply and spread out, not settle down in Shinar and build a city and a tower. You see, these people were disobeying the Lord. Now, we don't know why they did that. Maybe it's just an outright refusal. We're not going to obey the Lord. Could have been that. Could have been that some men like Nimrod and others, they wanted power and control, so you keep the people together so you can be in charge of them. It could have been fear. They could have been scared of spreading out. Let's just stay together. It's going to be easier to protect ourselves. It's going to be easier to grow what we need to grow. It's going to be easier to live life if we all just kind of stay together in this city. And while it's not wrong to settle down, it's not wrong to build cities, it was wrong for these people because God said, "Spread out, multiply, and fill the earth." Now, I want you to stop and consider how this might apply to us. How can fear and self-reliance display a lack of trust in the Lord? We are going to see in a minute that fear and self-reliance have no place in the believer's life. God is in control. God can take care of us. There's no need to be afraid. There's no need to rely on my power when God has all the power. These people settled down. They didn't do what God said do, and they decided we're going to build a city and a tower. We're going to make a name for ourselves, and we're going to stay safe. Well, let's see what happens in the next passage. Genesis chapter 11, verse 5. Then the Lord came down and looked over the city and the tower that the humans were building. The Lord said, "If they have begun to do this as one people, all having the same language, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let's go down there and confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech." Now here Moses says God came down. Now we need to understand that Moses is simply trying to help us understand what God is doing. God didn't literally have to come down and perform a site visit for the construction build. No, that's not what's happening. But I think we need to take a moment and let's do a little theology. I know it's a little rough, and I want you to look at it. I want you to look at some definitions of some words: omnipotence, omniscience, and sovereignty. Now I'm going to give you some definitions. I'm going to read some passages, and I'm going to ask you some questions. So just hold tight, and I want you to think hard with me for a few minutes. First, let's look at omnipotence. Omnipotence is the state of being all-powerful, which theology ascribes to God. For Scripture, God's omnipotence is not a matter of abstract speculation, but a force to be reckoned with. Psalm 65:6 says, "You establish the mountains by your power. You are robed with strength." Amos 4:13 says, "He is here, the one who forms the mountains, creates the winds, and reveals his thoughts to man, the one who makes the dawn out of darkness, and strides on the heights of the earth. The Lord, the God of armies, is his name." How might the reality of God's omnipotence affect the believer's life and the Christian's walk? There is no place for fear in our life because God can handle any and everything that comes our way. He is all powerful. We can now walk in confidence and power because we serve a God. We follow a God who is all powerful. What about omniscience? It's the state of being all-knowing, which theology ascribes to God. God's omniscience is not a matter of abstract speculation. Rather, God's knowing is a matter of personal experience. God knows us intimately. Psalm 139 verses 1 through 3. God, you have searched me and known me. You know where I sit down and where I stand up. You understand my thoughts from far away. You observe my travels and my rest. You are aware of all my ways. Psalm 34:15 through 16. The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their cry for help. The face of the Lord is set against those who do what is evil, to remove all memory of them from the earth. As before, how might the reality of God's omniscience affect a believer's life and the Christian's walk? The people in Genesis chapter 11 might have been afraid of what was out there, afraid of the unknown that's out there in the wilderness. But see, God knew what was out there. And similarly in our lives, God knows what's before us. God knows what the future holds, so we can stride confidently into the future, knowing that not only is God all powerful, but God knows what's coming our way. But what about God's sovereignty? Sovereignty is the biblical teaching that God possesses all power and is the ruler of all things. God rules and works according to his eternal purpose, even through events that seem to contradict or oppose his rule. Psalm 22 verse 28. For kingship belongs to the Lord. He rules the nations. Acts 17:56. From one man he has made every nationality to live over the whole earth, and has determined their appointed times and boundaries of where they live. And again, how might the reality of God's sovereignty affect the believer's life in the Christian walk? God's rule and reign over all things can produce a confidence in us that God is working things toward his purposes. And that purpose is eventually going to conclude in the new creation and a gathering of all his people into his presence for all eternity. We can see all three of these attributes of God in this passage. God's omnipotence is shown, his ability to eventually thwart their plans. God's omniscience is shown, that he knows what this tower is going to lead to. And God's sovereignty is shown in the fact that he is going to accomplish his purpose, which is to spread the people out across the world. God's not worried about their innovation. God's not worried about their unity, but God is concerned that they follow his plan, that they obey him. God's sovereignty is shown that he is going to accomplish his purpose, and God is going to help these people stop disobeying him. Now think on that. We look at the Tower of Babel and we think, well, God disciplined them and God spread them out. Well, God is helping them. God could just destroy them, but God shows mercy and he just stops them. And God helps them get on the path of following him. He does that by confusing their languages. Let's see what happens next in our passage. Look at verses 8 through 9. So from there, the Lord scattered them throughout the earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore it is called Babylon, for there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them throughout the earth. Having one language brought unity to these people. It allowed them to do this thing, build this city and this great tower. But it's also this unity that caused them to disobey the Lord, that enabled them to disobey the Lord. So the Lord's going to stop that. He's going to take away that unifying factor. He's going to confuse their language. Now, God isn't opposed to unity. Man, unity can be a great thing. When we're unified together for a purpose that intends to fulfill God's purposes, that can be a good thing. But what God is opposed to is those things in our life that enable us to disobey him. So I want you to stop and I want you to consider this idea of unity. How can unity of purpose get in the way of fulfilling God's purposes. Unity is not always a bad thing, but it can be. We all know it's easier to disobey and follow after ourselves when we do so with a group of people united in the purposes of disobeying the Lord. These people set out to build a city, set out to make a name for themselves, and the word play with Babylon and Babel and all that, it shows us that they were confused. They set out to make a name for themselves, and the name they made was City of Confusion, Tower of Confusion. That's the name they made. What are we going to learn from people in Genesis chapter 11? Are we going to learn to rely on ourselves, or are we going to learn to rely on the Lord? Are we going to disobey just because we want to disobey, or are we going to follow the Lord because he calls us to do that? Are we going to be prideful and make a name for ourselves, or are we going to follow after the Lord and make his name great? I want to ask you this week, how are you being led to disobey the Lord? I'm going to ask you to ask the Lord to pull out those things from your life that enable you to disobey. God confused their language to stop them. God had mercy on them to help them follow him. Ask the Lord to help you follow him this week and remove from you those barriers and those boundaries that cause you to disobey. I'll see you next week.